most of the horses and carts would be gone, and cars would be in their place. We are up to adaptation. We are up to change. What I have in mind when I'm talking about future of cars is electric, but our future is not cars. Is yes, I entirely endorse this. We need to be moving into electric cars where available, where possible. Yes, there are exceptions at the margin, but where I live in the city, I see vast numbers of people who could be doing it, and I recommend it. But here's the thing that we do in our family, and that is we have changed a car in more than 15 years because we're going to let that thing die. And we have, both of us have an e-bike, and we use that for many of our trips.
But and there are many. Okay, so you've got the e-bike thing going on a different board there. Can you see what Sally's saying? Sally Winley is talking about the practicalities on the farm.
I know, and I said that. I said that specifically. I talked about that there are exceptions at the margin where it's not going to apply. That doesn't disqualify forging ahead in the main with making this work because of the aforementioned climate crisis.
Sally?
Right. I hear what you're saying, but I think you're a bit lazy having an electric bike. Why don't you have a real one?
I've got both actually, Sally, and I've kind of used them both. I exercise greatly every day because of the aforementioned heart attack.
Yeah. Hey, look, good on you both. We've had such a huge response to all the comments here. We might actually come back to this electric vehicle one because we'd like to squeeze in a bit more. But for now, Sally Winley, David Seymour, thank you for your time. Can I ask you just briefly before we have 30 seconds there, Sally, you always come in here, you're just beaming with positivity, and to hear your story this afternoon at 3:45 was quite something from me personally. So kia ora and thanks for sharing, eh?
Well, thank you, Wallace, for making me feel comfortable doing it.
All right.
Kia ora.
I'm Wallace Chapman. Checkpoint with Lisa Owen is next. I'm back tomorrow, 3:45 till then.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere ake nei, details emerge of a clandestine meeting between protest intermediaries and David Seymour. Irresponsible, says the Prime Minister, but the ACT leader reckons it's time for mature de-escalation. He makes his case live. How many cars have been towed since the Police Commissioner issued that absolutely last end of the line, no more chances warning to protesters? Show us some more money. The calls grow for extra financial support for COVID-hit businesses. The Pacifica community bears the brunt of the Omicron outbreak and the domino effect of isolation. Auckland Council bins a controversial rubbish scheme, and the dress-up dolls that need a makeover of their own. Don't forget, you can catch us live, Sky Channel 83.
RNZ News at 5. Good afternoon. Kia ora tātou, Koivi Ashton tēnei. Hundreds of protesters' vehicles are still illegally parked across Wellington streets, despite the Police Commissioner saying they'd start being towed today. A short time ago, the police told a media conference they have towing companies prepared to shift the vehicles belonging to anti-mandate protesters that have been blocking roads around Parliament for more than a week. Assistant Police Commissioner Richard Chambers, who is also the head of the police operation overseeing the protest activity at Parliament grounds, says police negotiators have made good progress today in engaging with protest leaders, and some vehicles have been moved voluntarily. Wellington City Council has now handed out more than 500 parking tickets to the vehicles stopping the movement of traffic around the public service precinct. However, very few vehicles have been moved. There was a noticeably larger police presence around the perimeter of the blockade at some times today. The Minister of Police, Poto Williams, says she's frustrated with the protest and is being regularly briefed by police. The Prime Minister has attacked the ACT Party's leader for meeting the anti-mandate protesters. David Seymour and ACT MP Nicole McKee have met with representatives of the group protesting outside Parliament alongside the owner of the Backbencher pub. All other political parties have so far refused to engage with the anti-mandate protesters. Jacinda Ardern says Mr Seymour's move is irresponsible.
For a party that purports to be the champion of law and order, or indeed businesses, to meet with those who are obstructing Wellingtonians from going about their everyday lives, bullying and harassing people who are trying to go to school or work, I do think meeting with them was irresponsible.
David Seymour says he has set conditions before agreeing to speak to protesters, including moving their vehicles from around Parliament buildings. An anti-mandate protester who was part of a group staying in a Picton park says they will not leave. The Marlborough District Council says it'll start trespassing the protesters around now if they don't move to another park. The group has been in Nelson Square Reserve for 10 days. Craig Tuff, one of around 200 protesters at the park, says the plan is to stay until they've been listened to.
What's Jacinda's plan? But that's all we can give. If she comes and listens to us and we sort it tomorrow, we'll go home. And we want to go home. We don't want to be here. And if she doesn't, we'll wait.
Craig Tuff says many people are hurting from the mandates and want them reversed. The council wants the protesters to move to Waitohi Domain in Picton. 1 in 10 people at Middlemore Hospital's emergency department yesterday tested positive for COVID. It comes as national daily case numbers hit 4 figures for the first time. Health correspondent Rowan Quinn reports.
The hospital in Auckland gives rapid antigen tests to everyone who turns up for emergency treatment, even if it's not for COVID symptoms. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says that was about 250 people yesterday, and about 25 of them tested positive. That infection rate will be higher than the general population because some will be at hospital because they have COVID symptoms. There were 1,160 new cases today, meaning more than 23,000 people are known to currently have the virus.
And a Palmerston North woman says her 84-year-old relative had a 23-hour wait in the city's hospital's overcrowded emergency department before she was moved to a ward. Tania Putu called an ambulance for her relative, who had high blood pressure and breathing trouble, about 11 p.m. on February the 3rd. They arrived at hospital an hour later, but Tania Putu's relative had a long wait, at first in a side room and then in an emergency department bed in a walkway. She's made a complaint about the wait. Now to sport, and Auckland free skier Ben Barclay has finished 10th in the final of the men's big air event at the Beijing Winter Olympics. Barclay crashed on his first 2 runs but completed his third for a best score of 67.40. American Alexander Hall won the gold medal. SANZAAR says it intends playing a complete rugby championship this year across all 4 countries. The 2020 tournament was played in Australia without the Springboks, while last year all 4 teams took part, with most of the competition held in Australia. The announcement ends any speculation that South Africa was going to move to the Six Nations. Warriors coach Nathan Brown is optimistic the NRL club will have young fullback star Rhys Walsh for some time to come. Australian media reports have suggested Walsh is feeling uneasy at the Warriors and may end up back home in Queensland. The 19-year-old has 2 years remaining on his 3-year contract and found himself in trouble in the off-season when he was fined and placed on a 9-month good behaviour bond after admitting to cocaine possession.
Didn't even look into all that sort of stuff, mate. Don't worry about that too much. We keep working hard with Rhys, and I keep challenging him every day at training, and his training's improving, and I'm sure we'll get some good footy out of him over the next few years.
Warriors coach Nathan Brown. And the Phoenix men will play in their 4th different home venue in as many games when they host Brisbane at Leichhardt Oval in Sydney tonight. The Phoenix are 7th on the table, 3 points ahead of Brisbane. That's the news.
Prince Andrew settles out of court. This has come as a surprise, and there were really no good options for Prince Andrew here, not accepting any responsibility.
Novak Djokovic says he'll never get vaccinated.
The principles of decision-making on my body are more important than any title.
And Russia pulls back from the Ukraine border.
What the Russian Ministry of Defense says is that some units have been sent back to their bases. They haven't given us any number.
Wake up to the latest big stories from overseas. Morning reports weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
We're funded through New Zealand On Air. You're with Lisa Owen and Checkpoint next. First, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. For northern and western areas from Northland to Kapiti, including Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country, mostly fine. However, a few showers tomorrow afternoon and evening showers for inland areas from Taihapea to Bay of Plenty. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine at first, isolated showers developing this evening, then becoming confined to the ranges tomorrow morning. Wellington and Wairarapa also for Marlborough and Nelson. Mainly fine, isolated afternoon and evening showers about the Marlborough and Nelson ranges today and tomorrow. For Bulla and Westland, partly cloudy, a few showers for Westland clearing this evening. Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland, mostly fine. However, a few showers about Canterbury becoming confined to the foothills this afternoon, then clearing there at night. And for the Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy. It's 7 minutes past 5. We'll have news headlines for you at 5:30.
Kia ora rā, e ho tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. The blockade continues. Police say they've made progress speaking to the leaders of the protest on Parliament's front lawn. They're not the only ones. ACT leader David Seymour says he's done some backroom talking of his own, and we'll talk to him shortly. The Police Commissioner, Andrew Costa, this morning said towing would begin today, but not a single vehicle has been towed off the streets. A very small number of people have moved theirs voluntarily. Our reporter, Jake McKee, joins me now from the capital. Jake, you've just come from the police briefing. I mean, what have they had to say?
Yeah, so Lisa, police say they have made good progress today. They estimate about 12 vehicles have left here voluntarily through their own discussions. That's between police and the protesters. However, they finally have secured police towing services here that will be able to help them, but no one's been towed yet. When they look at this, they estimate there's going to be about 450 vehicles there. So that's 12 vehicles have left 450. Police also acknowledge that this is still growing. There are still vehicles actually coming in here, and that there has actually likely been more vehicles arrive than those 12 who voluntarily left. We spoke to Assistant Commissioner Richard Chambers about 20 minutes ago. Here's what he had to say.
We have made very good progress today engaging with a number of the leaders among the protest group. We have also seen, as a consequence of that, some vehicles moved voluntarily. I'd also like to acknowledge the public comments of some of those leaders within the group to demonstrate their intent to work with us to resolve this situation peacefully and taking into consideration the needs of the general public here in Wellington.
OK, Jake, so the police say that they're talking to influencers within the group, and what do they have to say about other people talking to the protest group as well?
So today we learnt that David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party, he has had talks with some of these people. Richard Chambers says he doesn't think that's going to be any issue on top of police negotiations. We asked if that was creating two streams that were going to cause issues, two different negotiations. But he says police are their own, politicians are their own, two different negotiations are fine. He doesn't think police need to be in that room with the politicians.
Jake, while you were just talking to me then, I think behind you there was a tow truck that went past. So, other shoulder, I'm wondering what direction that would have been heading in if it was. Is that in the direction of where they're all parked up?
That, if it was a tow truck, would have actually come just from the protest, which is about 200 metres behind us. That's actually a turn off onto the motorway. So that's suggesting someone's come and gone. If I didn't obviously see, but if someone was on it, they have started. Otherwise, they're tiki-touring around. OK, so how long do the police reckon this thing is going to go on for? An extended amount of time. There is no end goal here at the moment. The police have said they want to see it cleared quickly, but how quickly that is completely up in the air. And now that really plays into, you've got 450 cars estimated to be down there. That is a massive effort to try and relocate. But then beyond that, you've also got all the people on Parliament. So first they need to clear these streets for Wellington, and then that next step is getting people off the Parliament lawns.
Thank you for that, Jake. That's Jake McKee updating us there on the situation with the protest. Police say they reckon there's about 450 cars. About a dozen people moved their vehicles voluntarily today. Tow companies have been engaged, so we stand very by to see what happens next. A new COVID-19 record today as daily case numbers cross the 1,000 mark for the first time. 1,160 new cases have been recorded in the community, bringing the total cases to more than 23,000. It's day one of phase 2 in the government's Omicron response as New Zealand learns to live with the virus. But while restrictions are relaxing, authorities say now is not the time to be cavalier. People should keep scanning in. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
This is a reality New Zealand is still not used to, coexisting with COVID-19.
It's quite stressful, really.
I felt paranoid sometimes.
Pretty relaxed. I'm triple vax, so don't stay at home. Get out and live your life.
I think we've just got to accept it.
This is a different phase, but I think New Zealanders are ready for it.
Ready or not, it's here. Daily case numbers crossed 1,000 today, a melancholy milestone. 1 out of every 10 people who arrived at Middlemore Hospital's emergency department yesterday tested positive for the virus.
If we look at the experience from other countries, there is no doubt that case numbers will keep going up.
Countries like the United Kingdom have been swamped by Omicron, entire workplaces wiped out by what's been dubbed a pingdemic. That's hundreds of thousands of people having to isolate after being notified they've come into contact with COVID-19.
I think that everybody understands the inconvenience of being pinged.
Phase 2 of New Zealand's Omicron plan is designed to avoid that disruption, with shorter isolation periods and certain exemptions for critical workers. From today, most people will be sent a text message with their test result, positive or negative. Close contacts will be alerted through the COVID-19 app or via text, but the definition has been dramatically narrowed. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says from now on, only the most high-risk locations will trigger a notification.
They're not, for example, public transport or supermarkets and those sorts of places. So we don't need to necessarily identify people in those places as contacts.
That doesn't mean stop scanning in at restaurants and shops. It doesn't mean turn off Bluetooth. In fact, the opposite.
It's even more important and more useful to scan in at phase 2, because if you do get a notification through your app, then you're actually in one of those higher risk settings, and it's even more important to isolate there.
Scanning numbers have slipped back recently. In the lead up to Christmas, they were topping 3 million a day. The past week, they've been closer to 2 million. That could reflect less activity. It could also mean people have been worried about being caught as a close contact.
I try to do the best I can. Sometimes I forget.
No use doing it if they're not going to check them, is it?
This will rely on everybody doing what we've required really right through the last 2 years.
A new approach, but the same rules. Keep scanning, get boosted, and get tested if you have symptoms. This is Living with COVID-19.
It is 14 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora watu mo te whakarongo mai e haere ake nei. Has so-called apocalyptic COVID modelling led to a self-imposed lockdown? Irresponsible, in a word, that's how the Prime Minister summed up the ACT leaders' decision to meet some of those involved in the protest. On the other hand, David Seymour says it's time for a mature de-escalation of the situation, and he joins us now. Kia ora, David.
Tēnā koe.
Who did you meet exactly and why?
So I met a couple of people who asked not to be named, but they are people who have been involved in the protest and are connected and talking regularly to those who lead some of the various groups that make it up and are attempting to create what you'd call an emergent leadership team, so there's some coherence and the possibility of some dialogue there.
When you say involved with and connected to, what does that mean? Are they staying in a tent down there? Have they been on site? Can you give us a bit more detail about what their connection and involvement is? Or are they just the money people?
Well, I don't know anything about being the money people, and I don't know exactly where they're sleeping, but they've certainly been present over several days and in dialogue with some of those leaders. They're a couple of people who I understand are Wellingtonians and people who are very competent and reasonable, and basically say that ultimately there's got to be some dialogue. There's got to be what I call a mature de-escalation. It's interesting to hear the Prime Minister say it's irresponsible to even meet with intermediaries, because what her speaker has done with sprinklers and music and name-calling, and some of her own ministers have done with name-calling in recent days, I think has actually made the problem worse for those businesses, for people trying to go about their lives, for people annoyed the roads are blocked. There's actually people there now who are effectively protesting against the government's response to the protest. They've made it much worse than it needs to be. I think it's time to set some preconditions, clear the roads, clear Victoria University, allow businesses like Alistair Boyce, who invited me to go and meet some people at his pub. He's a very well trusted and respected, much loved publican across the road from Parliament at the backbencher. Actually have some dialogue so that these things can be wound down.
So do you know these people? Sorry to interrupt. Have you ever met the people that you met with today? Have you met them before or spoken to them before? Do you know them?
No, one told me that he'd met me before, but they weren't people that I had a prior relationship with.
So how do you know they're the real McCoy?
Well, everyone has to have some trust in the circumstance, and obviously it's very fluid, it's chaotic, but these people seem genuine and believe that they can pass a message on to this leadership. And like I say, the message that needs to go out is that if you stop blocking the road, stopping businesses occupying, and stop some of the more odious expressions that have made it so easy to hate on this protest, even if there is wider sympathy for some of their concerns, then I think you might get myself and potentially other members of Parliament prepared to open up in a dialogue. And I think that's essential, because at some point we're going to need to accept that whether or not we like everything they've done, these are humans, they're part of New Zealand, and at some point we're going to need to glue this country back together.
Do you sympathise with them? Do you sympathise with them?
Well, I certainly sympathise with their frustrations with the government's COVID response. I think that is widespread. Obviously, some of the views that they've expressed I'd have a bit less time for.
Okay, because you know the deal. The cars there are causing absolute calamity. Businesses are closed, pregnant women being harassed, students being harassed as well about wearing masks, etc. So why should anyone talk to them while that behaviour continues? And you have spoken to them while that behaviour is continuing.
Well, first of all, I put my trust in Alistair Boyce, who told me that he'd had to close his business because of some of that abuse. He came to me and said, look, can you come and talk to some of these people, because that has actually stopped for us, and we believe that the nature of the protest is changing. But second of all, if you're concerned about all those things, and I certainly am, what the government's done so far, and what Trevor Mallard's done in particular, has not improved any of it. In fact, arguably has exasperated the situation. In my view, the right way forward is what's been recommended by crisis negotiators on TV in the last few days. You need to set some preconditions, clear the roads, let businesses operate, stop refusing passers-by, and then they might get what they really want, which is to be listened to.
Did you check whether they were vaccinated, the people that you met with?
No, I think it was probably fair to assume that they might not be, but that's by the by. Okay.
So you took Nicole McKee with you. Why was that? Does she know them?
No, she doesn't have any personal connection, but at the present time, the ACT caucus is divided into two teams, like many businesses around New Zealand, for continuity. In case we get caught in the pandemic, we need people to be able to go to Parliament. She's a Wellington-based MP who was in my half of that team, so she was the logical choice.
Okay, I'm just really curious about these people. You say they're intermediaries to the leadership. What does that actually mean? Are they pulling the strings? Are they the decision makers? And if not, what is their relationship with the so-called leadership group that is emerging?
Well, as far as are they pulling the strings, I think, to be honest, it's been chaotic, and I don't think anybody is. But what they do have is connections with people who are respected within
What connections? What connections, well, David? Like business connections? Do they do business together? I mean, okay. Is one of these people that you met with a reasonably wealthy, well-known Wellington business person?
I think one of them would fit that description. But what they have is the ability to deliver a message which is what I wanted, which is that if this interruption and particularly some of the more odious aspects of the protest can stop, that's when dialogue might be possible.
Really appreciate your time this evening. That's David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party. Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. Is it naive of David Seymour to meet with these intermediaries? Is it irresponsible, as the Prime Minister says, or do you see some value in it? Let us know your thoughts. Pātui mai, text me 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Queenstown Hospitality is calling out for government support during the Omicron surge as isolation requirements push more to the brink. Restaurants are cutting back hours and closing their doors to cope, but some fear that without financial relief it may be permanent. Timothy Brown is in Queenstown.
Only a week ago, Queenstown was ostensibly COVID-free. Now it's the epicentre of Omicron in the South Island, with dozens of cases detected over the past 7 days. Dozens of tourism and hospitality providers are now also locations of interest, with staffing arrangements thrown into disarray. Fleur Colton, who owns and operates restaurants across the country, says the situation in Queenstown is particularly difficult.
We've got, 150 odd staff and, definitely a quarter in this first week have been caught up in some way or another. We're spending all of our time managing communications, talking to people, calming people down, deciding whether they can go to work or not go to work. So, it's challenging.
She says staff shortages were critical before Omicron arrived, and now they're just compounding.
We just don't have, enough staff barely to open, the hours that we should be open. Now with having to stand people down, it's just exacerbated it beyond the point where there's a lot of businesses that are closed.
Queenstown is unique as hospitality and tourism make up such a large proportion of its industry, and staff in those sectors work, live and socialise together, often with employees working across multiple sites. The impact of Omicron is already obvious, with most businesses along the Queenstown Mall shut for lunch service today. Fergburger Group General Manager Stephen Bradley says as a result, just a few cases have already caused massive headaches.
Obviously a good night out for someone, no surprise, is taken down half a town, and unfortunately some groups have been disproportionately affected, but majority of town has now been affected.
The current mood in the sector is one of stress, confusion and frustration, as they wonder why the delayed arrival of Omicron has been squandered by authorities who seem ill-prepared.
We attended a briefing last week from the DHB, and the information they gave out was wrong when we followed up on it. Constantly changing information on websites. But it's a difficult time for everyone. We can't hold that against people, but just the sheer confusion when we knew this was coming is unacceptable.
Mr Bradley says, in a word, it's a debacle. Checkpoint understands even critical businesses are being left in the lurch, as it's been impossible to source rapid antigen tests in the town, with the nearest available pickup points in Wanaka and in Invercargill. The Ministry of Health did not respond to Checkpoint's questions by deadline, and the Southern DHB directed us to Well South. A Well South spokesperson says there is a rat collection location in Queenstown. It just hasn't been loaded onto the Health Point website yet. Hospitality New Zealand Lower South Island Regional Manager Darrell Jenkins says the situation is critical for many. They surveyed members at the weekend and the results were stark.
Turnover has reduced by 60% or more for 31% of our respondents.
And that's since 2020?
That's since going to red light. That's pretty serious. 46% of our respondents said their turnover had reduced by 30 or more %. So that in itself is already massive.
She says without additional financial support, businesses will fold during the forthcoming Omicron wave. Queenstown's businesses were already doing it tough after 2 years with the borders closed, and no Aucklanders for a quarter of last year. Paying wages as large numbers of staff isolate and having their doors shut may be the final straw.
Dear Minister of Finance, show us some money, please. A group of Auckland business associations is writing to Grant Robertson, adding their voices to a growing chorus asking for more financial support for those hard hit by COVID, with some businesses believing the worst is still to come. The boss of the Newmarket Business Association, Mark Knopf-Thomas, is one of those putting pen to paper, and he joins us now. Kia ora, Mark.
Kia ora, Lisa.
Hey, the government says all businesses can continue to operate during Omicron, so why do you need more financial assistance for business?
Well, technically that's correct. All businesses can operate, but when that's against a backdrop of modelers saying that there's going to be tens of thousands of Omicron cases every day, or the zombie apocalypse is coming, public confidence has taken a complete nosedive, and all across the country in town centres we've seen foot traffic just all but disappear completely.
So what are you saying? It's virtually a self-imposed lockdown, or?
Well, it is. I think there's no confidence. And so the fact that people can trade is all well and good, but actually there's no one to trade with. And we're seeing from like central Auckland, for example, foot traffic numbers are diabolical. And, you know, if you're a hospo provider or a personal service provider or a retailer and you've got no customers coming past your business, you can't transact with them. So that seems to be the real problem. And the confidence, people are so afraid of getting COVID. There's an absolute culture of fear. They're terrified of getting COVID. They want to stay home and isolate so they don't have to go through, get exposed to it and have to go through the conditions of home isolation, which is being forced upon them. So they're doing it to themselves.
So that fear factor, to some degree it's justified, isn't it? Some people won't want to expose themselves, but who's responsible for creating that environment of fear that you are describing?
Well, I think the reality is, we've been asked by government, and, the vast majority of New Zealanders have gone along with this to get, have our first vaccine, our second vaccine and our booster, with the understanding this was going to give us sort of a level of certainty and relative safety. So, we've got a whole raft of protocols to follow in the COVID environment, which we're all well versed in now. So really, if people are, double vaxxed and boosted and they follow COVID protocols, life should have some relative normality. But there is an overlying fear, I think, across the community where people are literally afraid to leave their home sometimes to go out. And that's wrong. It's misguided, I think. And the government need to do something to bolster confidence within the community because it's gone too far and people are afraid to go out.
Something like what? You're talking about the Prime Minister rolling up for a beer at the local pub, or what?
The Prime Minister rolling up for a beer at backbenches would probably be quite timely at the moment, but the Prime Minister going out for a beer, visibility, a marketing campaign showing people that it's okay to go out and about. But that's also, there needs to be some targeted financial support for business too. So we're talking at, vast chunks of our economy, vast chunks of our trading sector who employ hundreds of thousands of people who have had 2 years of diabolical trade through, conditions that were, sort of brought on by themselves but brought on by external factors, coming off a very weak base. So the gas, there's no gas in the tank. There's no wage subsidy at the moment. There's no resurgence payment. There's no rent relief. Trade is down by the self-imposed lockdown, which seems to be happening around the country. It's just literally untenable.
So, Mark, when you talk about targeted relief, because the government has indicated that something's coming down the pipeline, who should get it in your view? Because arguably there are some businesses that were on the brink before COVID and this has just pushed them over the edge. So who should be in the targeted group?
Sure, and I think, in hindsight, the government's sort of broad brush approach in the earlier stages of the COVID response by giving everyone support possibly could have been a bit more tailored so they had a bit more cash to play with. But there are genuine businesses who were trading very successfully up until COVID who've had the carpet ripped from underneath them. It shouldn't be a universal sort of a universal support mechanism for everybody. It needs to be targeted and needs to be demonstrated against previous trading history, because what we don't want to see is a whole bunch of zombie businesses being carried through. I mean, in a general real market, there's going to be success and failure. That's just the nature of our economy, right, in good times and bad times. But the problem we've got is there's some very good operators who are now on the brink of collapse for reasons out of their control.
Didn't Newmarket have an absolutely gangbuster record December, and why isn't that being used to insulate these businesses that you're talking about?
Oh, we did. We had our best trading month in December in history, actually. But as I said, that's off against a backdrop of 2 years of appalling trade, where we had some months like December 2021, we did almost 90 million, but there were months in the year where we did 12 million. And in a good month, in a typical month, Newmarket would do around $60 million. But when it's down sort of $40-odd million in a month, you can see very quickly that of the 3,000 businesses trading in Newmarket, some of them are not getting very much at all.
Thank you for joining us this evening. That's Mark Knopf-Thomas, who is the boss of the Newmarket Business Association. Kia ora e te iwi e haere nei e a checkpoint. The government's plan to wrestle power from property managers. Auckland Council dumps a scheme that was supposed to slash the amount of rubbish headed to the tip. And do store mannequins reflect what you see in the mirror? Homai o whakaaro, we'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. You can text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, and then there's the good old-fashioned email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines. Ane a iwi mina pita pita kōrero.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon. Ko iwi Ashton tēnei. The police in Wellington are holding off towing hundreds of illegally parked vehicles belonging to anti-mandate protesters at Parliament because they're making good progress on negotiations. Yesterday, protesters were given an ultimatum to move their cars or they'd be towed, and that warning was reiterated this morning, but the day has passed with no action. At a media conference a short time ago, the Assistant Police Commissioner Richard Chambers, who is also the head of the operation overseeing the protest activity, says police don't want to inflame the situation. ACT's leader David Seymour says he's talked to a couple of people from the protest who are connected to an emergent leadership team. He told Checkpoint there's some coherence and the possibility of some dialogue. One of the anti-mandate protesters refusing to leave a Picton Park says they want the government to hear the pain caused by the COVID-19 mandates. A couple of hundred protesters have refused to leave Nelson Square Reserve by the 5 p.m. deadline set by the Marlborough District Council. The council says it will now start trespassing people. Health authorities are urging people to keep on scanning with the COVID-19 app as Omicron numbers reach new heights. From today, only the most high-risk locations of interest will trigger a notification, alerting people they're a close contact. The period of self-isolation for close contacts has also dropped from 10 days to 7. And 4 people were forced to leap into an inflatable dinghy to escape their burning boat off Wellington's south coast today. They sent up a mayday from the 13-metre launch just before midday out from Island Bay. A nearby commercial fishing vessel and the police launch went to their aid. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 6 o'clock.
Nā mihi iwi no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Time for business now. Ko taku hoa inai ko Nona Peltier. Let's talk Fletcher Building. Nona, it's reported a solid first half result with a positive outlook. What did it make?
It made $171 million in the 6 months to December versus $121 million the year earlier. Now, most of that was in the second quarter of that period because the first 3 months was affected really by the lockdowns, and then as restrictions eased in Auckland, the company was able to return to a more normal operation. And so, yeah, they said the second quarter really went gangbusters for the company, and they think that there's going to be more improvement in the second half. Even with some of the downturn in the housing market, they're not going to see that in their sector at all. They're expecting the construction sector to continue to boom. There's loads of building consents in place, big pipeline of work, plus a backlog as well. So they're saying that overall, a very strong outlook for the rest of the year. And also they're saying that if there is any disruption as a result of the Omicron variant, they're expecting that would probably only affect them between 25 and 50 million in the second half. Now, that sounds like a big number, but that would be against an underlying profit of 750 million.
And global dairy prices are going gangbusters. What details have you got for us?
Yeah, so global dairy prices have hit their highest level in 8 years. So the average price, that's across, all sorts of types of dairy, rose 4.2% to US dollar $4,840 per ton. So that followed a 4.1% increase in the previous auction. So over the last 3 auctions, we've seen quite substantive gains, and really it's across the board. Prices for other products was up, including butter, cheddar, skim milk powder, but most importantly the price of whole milk powder, which is the one that strongly influences the payouts for our local farmers, rose 4.2% to $4,503 a ton. That's US dollars. That's a really strong number, and it certainly looks like these are numbers that are going to continue for some time. The outlook is really strong for commodities generally, and most especially for dairy, but I guess that means that consumers are probably going to be facing some higher prices at the grocery store.
Okay, Nona, wow us with some market numbers there.
Okay, so the Fletcher Building result was definitely a good positive for the market. It rose 7%, their share price. And the NZX, it ended up, the top 50 index ended up 1.5%, 184-point gain to 12,122. And that was in line with what we were seeing in Asia as fears about a Russian invasion to the Ukraine or in the Ukraine has dissipated somewhat. So that was positive for the market. The New Zealand dollar is steady at 66.4 US cents, 92.8 Australian, and 49 British pence.
Kia ora rā e hoa, ka kite Nona Peltier there with business news. Now, protesters in Picton are digging in and refusing to leave, passing the deadline they'd agreed on to leave. Some protesters who couldn't make it to Wellington set up camp just across the Cook Strait over a week ago. Now, they had promised to move on by 5 o'clock tonight, but they're still there and saying they'll stay while there are still protesters in Wellington. Our reporter Samantha G joins us now from Picton. So, Samantha, how many people are we talking about, and what's the feeling at this, camp, I suppose?
So we're talking a few hundred people there at the moment. The numbers have fluctuated since they arrived last Monday. I believe the first protesters were there. But now we're looking at maybe around 100 vehicles, lots of tents, camper vans, and it's quite a chilled out vibe, really. It's, we haven't seen any sort of anger at this point. Everyone looks like they're having quite a good time in the fine weather.
And so what are they saying about their intentions and what they want to achieve?
So protesters had met with the Marlborough District Council and agreed to move off this site at Nelson Square by 5 p.m. today, and they haven't done that. They've said that they're going to remain at the square while there are still protesters in Parliament, and because they want to see these mandates reversed. So we haven't seen anyone move to the Domain, the Waitohi Domain that the council had said that they could use. They've chosen to remain at this Nelson Square.
And so what more have the Marlborough Council had to say?
So the council have said that they will be taking some enforcement action, and I spoke with Marlborough Mayor John Leggett earlier, and this is what he had to say.
From last Friday and from the meeting then, we made it very clear that the enforcement action must follow, and that will be in the form of issuing trespass notices, remembering that the action that we are going to be taking has been done in consultation with police, with Marlborough Roads, Waka Kotahi. And certainly the spokespeople are aware that their continued occupation of Nelson Square is illegal. They're perfectly aware of that. It's been reinforced to them.
And so, Sam, what are locals saying about all of this?
So there is a bit of a mixed reaction. There are some that sort of live right near the square here that understandably have been a bit frustrated by the noise and the occupation. I understand that the Marlborough District Council have received close to 200 complaints about noise, and some of those were in the initial days when people first arrived.
Oh, I think we've just lost Samantha there. Samantha G reporting on the other group of protesters, and they're in Picton and have refused to move by the deadline that was set today. They said they would go, they haven't. Council not too happy about that. We'll keep you up to date on progress. Now, Auckland Council is scrapping a rubbish bin tag scheme that was supposed to reduce weekly waste. The pay-as-you-throw trial means residents on the North Shore, West Auckland and Papakura have to buy bin tags and attach them to their wheelies for weekly weekly collection. Now, the tag price depends on the bin size. In other suburbs, the cost of weekly rubbish pickup is included in the rates. The trial was supposed to encourage people to bin less, so they pay less. But it turns out that the scheme wasn't a cheap deal at all. And joining me now is Parul Sood, the General Manager of Waste Solutions at the Council. Parul, why are you getting rid of this?
Oh, we've had a hard look at it to see whether it's delivering, as you said, is it winning less or is it winning more? And we've had a look at the entire scheme to show us the evidence of what the system's actually achieving. So as a result, the proposals that will be coming to Aucklanders are proposing to move to a rates-funded service.
So, Parul, can I take from that it achieved absolutely nothing, and that's why you're getting rid of it in terms of changing people's rubbish habits?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it achieved nothing. I think what's happened over a period of time is we've changed from bags, we've gone on to bins, the size capacity of the bins have gone higher. And in the rates-funded areas, what's happened, if you remember, old legacy Manukau area where they had unlimited bags, they moved to bins. So in a way, the systems have kind of shifted, they've changed. And what we've found in the evidence that we've looked at, that people in Waitakere and North Shore are producing more or less the same as in Manukau and Auckland. And the trends in Manukau have actually come down, so that's quite encouraging. So there is no conclusive evidence to say the pay-as-you-throw system has achieved massive reduction.
Yeah, OK. So put bluntly, what you thought would happen, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if people had to pay according to the volume of waste that they were putting out, they'd cut their waste in order to get a cheaper deal. But that didn't happen.
That's right.
OK. So given then that they were being charged a significant amount, are you going to give them some kind of rebate for that? Because it turns out that the scheme is more expensive than paying with your rates, doesn't it?
It depends, actually, because what we've come up with is to say you actually will have an option of 3 bin sizes. So you can, if you are a low producer of waste, you can go with the smallest size possible. And that would give you the option of paying less for that bin size, and in the rates you'll be paying less. What the scheme also is trying to do is to say, how do we get more economies of scale and have a cheaper deal all over? So what we found in our evidence is that if you do it across the region, if you've got everybody on the scheme, then it definitely is cheaper to serve and to provide that service overall.
So this is kind of based on the polluter pays principle, right? And things like this have worked overseas. So what's wrong with us here? Why didn't it work for us?
Yes, what we found is overseas, the polluter pays model sits quite differently within the context. So what happens here, if I live in Waitakere, so I can choose to be on council's tag service, which is really getting me to think about what I'm putting out and, doing it, just getting paid for it every time I put it out. But then I can also go to a private operator and get a subscription service, which then means my neighbor can put out, the same amount every week, as much as they want, for a fixed rate. So that doesn't quite affect their behavior. So the setting in which this was done has not affected the behavior change. And also, I guess, the amount has not triggered that need. So for people, it's gone, it's just, so much. It's not enough to make them think.
So you reckon you should have made it more expensive and that would have motivated people to put less rubbish out?
Some examples overseas have shown, yes, that does create an impact. But I think what would help is having alternative bins to have, like your food scraps, put out in another collection. And also looking at having smaller bin sizes to actually kind of get that volume down in terms of when you're putting it out.
So just simply give them less space so they can only fit so much in.
That's right. The other thing that has worked in other places is the frequency of collection. So rather than having a weekly rubbish collection, have a weekly food scraps collection and a fortnightly recycling and a fortnightly rubbish collection. That's another way of making people think about it.
Okay, so I know you're working on the food scraps thing, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to, across the board, cut the size of the bins that people in Auckland have to put their rubbish in?
So that's exactly the reason why we've kind of gone with the 80 litre. So at the moment, your default bin is a 120 litre bin. So, and then again, people go to the maximum size of a 240 as well. So we will have the option of 80 litre because food scraps will take away a good chunk of what you've got in your rubbish bin now.
Parul, I just want to be clear on this. You say the option of an 80 litre. Are you going to enforce an 80 litre bin on people in the future versus the 120 or the 240 that they've got access to now? Will they be forced to take a smaller bin?
To start with, we wouldn't be enforcing because we need to be mindful of different circumstances for different households.
Okay, but to start with is not a definite no. So are you going to phase in smaller bins, the 80 litre bin?
To start with, we will have an option. We will not be enforcing that.
But in time, are you going to remove the option?
We would, yeah. So what we are looking to work towards is actually the frequency side of things that I mentioned. So to actually go fortnightly for rubbish, because you will not have anything that's smelly in your bin unless you've got kids, little babies with nappies, and even then you can use reusable nappies. Only we would be looking to going to a fortnightly collection rather than forcing everybody to go on an 80 litre.
But that, in essence, cuts the amount of rubbish you can put out by half because you're only getting the bin picked up every 2 weeks. Okay, so what does all of this mean for the council's aim to get to zero waste to landfill by 2040? How far are you away from achieving that? Is it still an achievable goal?
So this action, as you can imagine, relates to residential collections. So the residential collections or the residential waste that we put out makes about 15 to 20% of the total waste that goes to landfill. So we are doing a lot more work in other parts of the sector as well to see how do we get construction and demolition waste down and how do we get commercial waste down to actually achieve our goal of zero waste by 2040. There are a whole lot of other elements that need to come in play that are probably government-led in terms of changing legislation, having product stewardship schemes come in to get us there. In terms of saying whether we'll get there by 2040, that is the hope and that is a desire. We're working towards it, but there is a way to get there.
Okay, so for the people who are in this trial area, Parul, who are sitting on the edge of their seat wondering how much they're now going to have to pay for their rubbish, you're getting rid of the tag scheme. So are you going to include a fee in their rates, and what will it be?
This is still in the proposal stage, so we will be coming out with all the details in terms of what that would be as part of the annual budget consultation process. We will be engaging with the community on this to give them exactly what the numbers would be. What would that mean on their rates bill if that is the way we choose to go?
So when do they stop using their tags?
Oh, the decision hasn't been made yet. So the consultation, I think, starts on the 28th of Feb. It's open till the 28th of March, so I would really encourage listeners to actually put in their feedback. And the other thing I would say is have a read of the actual proposal and the reason why we are looking at going this way, and then please give us your feedback.
So can you guarantee those people that it's going to be cheaper to get their rubbish collected, given what you've worked out from this scheme?
In the long term, yes, the intention is for it to be more economically viable and better for the city.
Appreciate your time this evening. That's Parul Sood, who's from Auckland Council Waste Solutions, the General Manager there. It is 13 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Hey, Muriaki ina pita pita kōrero. After the news at 6, when is this Wellington protest going to be over? The Ministry of Health has revealed there's been a surge in the number of positive COVID cases in Pacific communities. Pacifica people now make up about half of the cases in the Omicron outbreak, and most of them are in Auckland. RNZ Pacific's Lydia Lewis has more.
Every new case jolts the community with flow-on effects that are far-reaching.
What we've seen over the last few days is quite a big increase in the cases for Pacific. We did anticipate this. It's what we've seen internationally.
The government has moved Aotearoa into phase 2 of the COVID response. It's all about flattening the curve. There is now widespread community transmission of Omicron, and the Ministry of Health's Pacific Director Geraldine Clifford-Lidstone has confirmed a large chunk of the cases are among Pacific peoples.
At the moment, there's about 50% of the cases are Pacific people and mainly in the Auckland region. So A positive thing about that is that we, do have the DHBs in the northern region have set up a response, and it's a specific response, so very tailored to the needs of Pacific communities.
Europa Kupu is on the front line in Tamaki Makaurau. She's the whānau's COVID welfare manager. She says the situation is serious, with entire households contracting Omicron, good people falling into hardship and not knowing what to do.
At the moment, it's just increasing by the day, so we're getting up to probably since last month, maybe close to 100 now.
Europa and her team have been run off their feet. She says no one was prepared for this. They've been dealing with stressed parents, children who are over it, and vulnerable people needing ongoing support.
It's a scary time for families, especially not experiencing it before.
Village Collective is a youth organisation in Auckland. General Manager Latoya Henry Jenkins says he's seeing a lot of hardship too.
It is concerning because the impact that we see on the ground in regards to youth, the young people being sent home, the rest of the families have to isolate until they get the green light. This is happening frequently, so the disruption caused by the frequency of self-isolation while testing is happening is concerning.
Geraldine Clifford Lidstone says she is aware of the severity of the problem.
The risk factors for Pacific are always going to be very high, and this is mainly because we've got higher rates of comorbidities, so long-term condition. We tend to have multi-generational and multi-family households.
She's urging everyone, Pacifica or not, to follow public health advice. She says the general public has a significant role to play to keep everyone safe.
Please get vaccinated, please get your booster shot, and please get your children vaccinated as well.
There's been a cautious response in the West to some signs Russia might be prepared to ease tensions with Ukraine. Russia has declared it wants more talks with the West, and it started withdrawing some military resources from border areas. The BBC's Steve Rosenberg has the latest.
Russia's army on the move, and apparently heading away from Ukraine's border. Moscow announced it's pulling back some of its troops. Is it a signal the Kremlin is ready to de-escalate? Russia says it's proof it is not preparing an invasion. In Moscow, socially distanced diplomacy. Germany's Chancellor with his work cut out, clearly, to get Vladimir Putin to ease tensions even further. Still, the Kremlin's ready to talk.
There are some things we are ready to discuss. It was us who suggested them on European security, medium and short-range missiles, and military transparency. We are ready to continue our joint work.
The Kremlin hasn't got what it really wants: Ukraine barred from joining NATO. But East and West are now talking about European security, and it seems those discussions will continue. So some positive signs then of diplomacy and de-escalation, but it's still unclear how this crisis will end. One thing's certain though, Vladimir Putin is loving the attention, loving the fact that world leaders have been lining up to come here to talk to him, because that puts Mr. Putin exactly where he wants to be, slap bang centre of the geopolitical stage. But the muscle flexing hasn't stopped completely. Some Russian military drills are continuing near Ukraine's border. The number of troops Moscow has actually pulled back isn't clear.
Mannequins have decorated store windows for hundreds of years, but in terms of size and shape, well, they've stayed relatively the same. Now there are renewed calls for them to better reflect the broad range of people who actually wear clothes. Louise Tanuth and Marika Habazi filed this report.
It wouldn't be the full shopping experience without seeing a mannequin dressed in the latest trend. So Checkpoint asked shoppers whether they feel represented by what's in the window.
I reckon some should be like bigger sizes and not just the same size, so everyone knows like what they want to get. If they see it on a mannequin, they know that, they'll see it on themselves.
Well, I mean, I'm 4'11", and I like to see like clothes on the mannequins, and I'm like, oh, that looks gorgeous.
and I try it on, and it's like dangling down here. I'm like way too tight over there.
Quite skinny and slim. Not really suited for everyone.
So you reckon they should maybe change up the sizes?
Yeah, get kids ones as well. You only see the adult ones.
Because they usually don't really style them that well, so I don't really bother looking.
Probably the size. It's so impersonal nowadays. I would rather see like videos and like pictures of real people.
I have a few friends that are like plus size or like medium plus size-ish. It's really hard for them to find clothes because they can't see it. And even online, like on models that are plus size, it's still really hard to say. I just think that mannequins are all the same size. It's just not accurate because it's also not the average size, I would say, either.
So this is really dispatch and paint. I paint here, so I go out the back there and paint. These guys have had undercoat on them. This one's almost going to have his top coats tomorrow, actually. And the same with that one up there, which is Diane. And this guy...
Glenn Wilkin-Holland has been in the mannequin-making business since the 70s. In fact, he's the last business left in the country. We're here at his house-turned-factory, where he does it all himself nowadays. You can't enter a room without there being some sort of mannequin, from heads to smaller dolls and even random limbs hanging from the ceiling. So after over 50 years, has much changed when it comes to size?
There is a demand, a more realistic kind of approach to larger sizes now, especially in the calico-covered forms, and we do up to size 18. And with the expanding dressmakers, we almost go up to 20.
Nearly 2/3 of their customers used to be retail. Now it's down to a quarter. Glenn says the majority aren't opting for more inclusive sizing.
They'll design a 10 and you'll grade down twice to 6 and 8, and then you'll go up twice to 12 and 14s. And so kind of that's the biggest, that's the middle there, really, in a 10.
And it's not just size that's lacking when it comes to representation.
Like when they did that Auckland display up at Auckland Museum, there was 2 or 3 with Polynesian sisters, and kind of like those were all Indonesian flesh. Really hard to sell that though to kind of stores on Queen Street.
At Vixen on Karangahape Road, the mannequins are vintage, just like the clothes. For that reason, sales assistant Mia Bella Brothers says they're lacking in different sizes.
It's kind of like either like really small or really tall. It's like, I guess there could be a lot more inclusivity around that.
Mia says it's more about showing off the elaborate accessories rather than everyday clothes people wear, but she admits there's room for improvement.
It would be great to have some more sort of different sizes within the mannequins so that we could like change them up more.
Dietitian Kate Sayers is echoing this call.
What we see at the moment is not representative of what a real body shape is like. So if we are seeing more normal body shapes out there, a range of shapes, then what it's telling people who are in that situation and everyday people that it's a true representation of our bodies.
She works at Shelley Beach Practice in Auckland and specialises in helping patients with disordered eating. She says a lack of representation in stores can have severe repercussions.
When we're working with people with weight and shape concerns, or they have an eating disorder or disordered eating, they spend most of their day thinking about weight, shape and food. So if that's all you're thinking about when you head out and about and you see representation around you of how a body should be, that's what you're connecting with, and then you're making a comparison yourself. So it can be very, very triggering.
And there's some long overdue change that could help with that.
If everyone jumped on board in the movement and said, okay, let's be representative, let's have a range of body shapes and sizes, let's have sizes that we might not have already had in the shop, then there's less likely to have negative feedback because it's a movement that's changing across.
But until then,
we are seeing quite an increase, in that space at the moment that's really concerning. So it does suggest that what's currently happening out there might not be working.
They're not able to take on any more patients despite referrals tripling over the last 2 years, highlighting the urgent calls for a fashion overhaul.
And if you're listening to that piece from Louise and filmed by Marika Habazi, do go online and check out the video. It'll be on our webpage. Now, a traffic update. There's been a crash between two trucks on Auckland's southwestern motorway near Puhunui Road. The southbound lanes are blocked, but heavy haulage crews are on site and are expected to help move them soon. Motorists remain advised to avoid the area at this time or expect delays. Well, we pushed button A with our interview with David Seymour, who's been talking to people connected to the protesters. Split down the middle. Good on you, David Seymour, for fronting, says Trish. Another person says there was David Seymour surging along in the polls and all of a sudden he's become irrelevant. His actions today won't improve that problem that he has. David Seymour's the only adult in the room at the moment, one listener says. On the other hand, this person says, I'm done with David Seymour. First he embraces the gun lobby, now the mob. What next? A meeting with the devil? When the lunatics take over the asylum, negotiation's not an option, says this listener.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening. Kia ora tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. Police are holding off towing hundreds of illegally parked vehicles belonging to anti-mandate protesters at Parliament because they say they're making good progress on negotiations. Yesterday, protesters were given an ultimatum to move their cars or they'd be towed, and that warning was reiterated this morning. But the day has passed with no action. Assistant Police Commissioner Richard Chambers says police don't want to inflame the situation.
We need to think about what our tactics could be and how best do we deal with those to prevent escalation of a situation while we're making good progress with the protest influences, albeit small steps.
Mr Chambers says a small number of vehicles have been moved voluntarily today. ACT leader David Seymour won't name anti-mandate protesters he met with today, but says one is a well-known Wellington business owner. Mr Seymour met the group following a request from the owner of the Backbencher pub across the road from Parliament. He says now's the time for a mature conversation about de-escalating the demonstration. He told Checkpoint the protesters he met are connected to leaders of various factions at the demonstration.
What they have is the ability to deliver a message which is what I wanted, which is that if this interruption and particularly some of the more odious aspects of the protest can stop, that's when dialogue might be possible.
David Seymour says he sympathises with the protesters' frustrations at the government's COVID-19 response, but has less time for their other views. An anti-mandate protester who's part of a group staying in a Picton Park says they would leave if the Prime Minister came to listen to them. The Marlborough District Council says it'll start trespassing the protesters this evening if they don't move to another park. The group has been in Nelson Square Reserve for 10 days and the council has offered them space at Waitohi Domain. Craig Tuff, one of around 200 protesters, says if the Prime Minister came and listened to them, the issue could be resolved by tomorrow. But until that happens, they'll remain. Health authorities are urging people to keep on scanning with the COVID-19 app as Omicron numbers reach new heights. 1,160 new cases were recorded in the community today, bringing the total cases to more than 23,000. From today, only the most high-risk locations of interest will trigger a notification, alerting people they're a close contact. The period of self-isolation for close contacts has also dropped from 10 days to 7. Queenstown's hospitality providers want government support to survive the Omicron surge. Businesses are cutting back hours and closing their doors as large numbers of staff isolate due to close contact requirements. There are fears that without financial relief, some may not reopen. RNZ understands even critical businesses have struggled to access rapid antigen tests in the town on day one of Phase 2. Hospitality New Zealand Regional Manager Daryl Jenkins says for many, the situation is critical.
Turnover has reduced by 60% or more for 31% of our respondents since going to red light.
Daryl Jenkins says another 15% of respondents had seen turnover drop by at least 30%. A Palmerston North woman says her 84-year-old relative had a 23-hour wait in the city hospital's overcrowded emergency department before she was moved to a ward. Tanya Putu called an ambulance for her relative, who had high blood pressure and breathing trouble, at about 11 p.m. on February the 3rd. They arrived at hospital an hour later, but had a long wait, at first in a side room and then in an emergency department bed in a walkway.
We were there all day, and at 8 o'clock that night she was still sitting in that walkway. The nurses had seen her and she'd had tests done and stuff, and they were lovely, if not very pushed. I think it was about 11 p.m. she finally got admitted to a ward.
Tanya Putu has made a complaint about the wait. And 4 people were forced to leap into an inflatable dinghy to escape their burning boat off Wellington's south coast today. Constable Carl Smith from the Wellington Maritime Police say emergency services picked up a mayday call from the 13-metre launch just before midday. He says nearby commercial fishing vessels got there just before the police launch and had pulled up alongside the dinghy. He saw the fire take hold.
As we got there, that smoke changed to dark black and started billowing out as it really took hold. But initially, it didn't seem like a lot, We thought that we may have been able to put some water on it and take care of it. But as we arrived, it completely engulfed the upper structure and it really took hold. There was no chance of stopping it.
Kyle Smith says there were 2 men and 2 women on board, all in their 60s. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Matt McAvoy on his new book, 30 Queer Lives. 30 rainbow stories from across Aotearoa. The Kiwi Runners family tree is this week's Hump Prize. Listen for the sound clue if you want to be in the running. And Hayden T from Magatoroto to Broadway, now back in Auckland, celebrating the villain in his new cabaret show at the Civic. On Nights of me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
You're back with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint shortly. First, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. For northern and western areas from Northland to Kapiti, including Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Mostly fine, however, a few showers tomorrow afternoon and evening showers for inland areas from Taihape to Bay of Plenty. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine at first. Isolated showers developing this evening, then becoming confined to the ranges tomorrow morning. Wellington and Wairarapa, also Marlborough and Nelson. Mainly fine, isolated afternoon and evening showers about the Marlborough and Nelson ranges today and tomorrow. For Buller and Westland, partly cloudy, a few showers for Westland clearing this evening. Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland, mostly fine. However, a few showers about Canterbury becoming confined to the foothills this afternoon, then clearing there at night. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy. It's 6 minutes past 6. We'll have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Thanks, Evie. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. As yet another day passes with police seemingly unable to deliver on threats to tow the protesters' vehicles and free up the streets around the capital, frustration is growing in the Windy City. And images of the party-like atmosphere in the tent city with free food deliveries and clothes are only fuelling the annoyance of locals whose daily activities are being severely curtailed. Councillor Fleur Fitzsimons says people in Wellington have been threatened and intimidated, and it's time the protesters went home. She joins me now. Kia ora, Fleur.
Kia ora.
Now, you've been out and about around the protest over the last few days. I mean, what is it like for people trying to move around, and what's your experience been?
Yeah, it's really, really difficult, and people have had enough. And look, I do want to start by saying that Wellington is an inclusive and welcoming city. We're a capital city. We don't just accept protests, we welcome them, and usually we're bending over backwards to accommodate groups that want to express their democratic rights. But this has gone too far. We've just seen hideous behaviour. There's been menacing acts, physical abuse, death threats and vandalism. And that's not even to mention the conduct that has completely undermined the public health of shop assistants and cafe workers and public servants who are just trying to go about their day and their lives. It's too much and it needs to stop now.
Do you feel safe in that part of town?
No, not at all. It is not a safe part of town to be in. They are out of control. And look, my message to them is that they need to go home. They need to reach out to their family, to their friends. They need to do that.
They've been told, goodness knows how many times it is time to go. You've had your opportunity. You've stated your case. Please leave. I mean, how many last warnings do they get from the police? They're not leaving. So what is anyone supposed to do?
And I think we need to keep saying it. We need to try and get through to them. Is to reach out to your family and friends, to talk to your GP, to ration your time on Facebook. And look, I also want to send a message to the family and friends of those protesting. And I have some supporters of them in my own family. But if you can, and if it's safe to do so, please reach out to them, ask them to go home, tell them that Wellington's had enough, because we do need to try and get through to these people. We need reason to prevail.
So, Fleur, do some of your family members know some of the protesters, or do they support the cause?
Yeah, I've got family members posting on Facebook in support of it, and it's very difficult. But we all need to do our bit to try and get through to these people, to reason with them in clear ways and try and get away from the conspiracy theories, the lies and their approach here, because it's not working for anyone. People are terrified.
So are you talking to your family members about that stuff?
Absolutely, but it's difficult. But we've got to keep doing it, because this is just not an acceptable way for a city to operate.
Well, who is in control of the city right now?
Well, at that part of town, it is in a very dire situation, and they're abusing the precious democratic rights and exploiting the freedoms that they somehow claim to have lost.
So the authorities, the police, the council, nobody has control over that part of town at the moment. The protesters do.
Well, look, as a Mayor City Councillor, I'm not about to second guess the police actions. I feel really sorry for them. It's a real drain on their resources. But of course, if there is more they can do, I want them to do it. Wellingtonians want them to do it. We're getting sick of this.
Do you have any idea of what the more would be?
Well, there is, I know, and you've heard already and you've had on your program, some further steps that the police are looking at, and I certainly support them, because something has to change here. And look, as Omicron grows, the urgency for them to leave grows. And I really just hope they see sense and go home, because Wellingtonians don't deserve this.
So, Fleur, if you really think there needs to be basically a negotiated way forward here, do you support David Seymour going down and having a chat to some of them?
No, I absolutely don't. Look, so many community groups I deal with every day try really hard to have their voices and their legitimate grievances heard by decision makers in Wellington. Some of them wait months for a chance to be heard. And David Seymour's approach basically says to all those groups, if you want to get heard, vandalise, abuse and lie, and then we'll listen to you. That's not the New Zealand I want.
But on the other hand, Fleur, no attempt to get them moving has worked at this stage. Like, the Speaker's tactics haven't worked, the police asking nicely hasn't worked. So does someone need to step forward and have a discussion with them to try and move it on, which is what David Seymour has done?
Yeah, look, and everybody is trying to do that. But David Seymour has got a real double standard going on. He was all about evicting people at Himato. He had no interest in dialogue there. But then we have a far less coherent and worthy group of people here in Wellington, bringing Wellington to a halt, spreading lies, menacing kids, and all of a sudden they deserve a seat at the table. I just don't accept that David Seymour is someone to look at. I think it shows something very sad about David Seymour, that he has harsher words for Māori asserting their rights in a peaceful way than he can come up with in terms of this vile protest in Wellington.
Really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for joining us. That is the Wellington City Councillor Fleur Fitzsimons there. And a Palmerston North woman has been left dismayed after waiting with her elderly relative for almost a full day in the city's hospital emergency department before they were moved to a ward. The woman's relative was rushed to hospital with breathing difficulties and high blood pressure. Jimmy Allingham reports.
Tanya Potu phoned an ambulance for her 84-year-old relative about 11 p.m. on Thursday, February the 3rd. An hour later, her relative was taken to hospital, but her ordeal had only just begun. With no free beds in the overcrowded Palmerston North Hospital Emergency Department, Tanya Potu and her relative were ushered into a waiting room.
So we knew we were hunkering down for a while. I was just concerned because my 84-year-old relative was having trouble breathing and her blood pressure was 220 over 110, which is really high. And it was just really uncomfortable for her.
7 hours later, Tanya Potu went home for a rest, about 6 a.m, and another family member took over staying with their relative. 9 hours after arriving, the elderly woman was given a bed in an emergency department walkway, but the long wait for a move to a ward continued. At one point it was suggested to Tanya Potu that she'd take her relative home, but she was too concerned about her health to do that.
We were there all day, and at 8 o'clock that night she was still sitting in that walkway. The nurses had seen her and she'd had tests done and stuff, and they were lovely, if not very pushed. I think it was about 11 p.m. she finally got admitted to a ward, so that worked out to be about 23 hours of sitting and waiting for an 84-year-old.
New Zealand Resident Doctors Association National Secretary Dr Deborah Powell says the association's members are reporting constant concerns about the Palmerston North Hospital Emergency Department.
They're reporting patients are waiting long times to be seen. They're understaffed, under-resourced, and the department is just too small. They don't have enough beds for the number of patients they're seeing.
Tanya Potu's relative has recovered well and was well looked after by hospital staff. But the family wonder how sustainable it is for staff to work in such conditions and worry people don't get the level of care they expect and need.
The other thing that concerns me is this was just a Thursday night, so what happens when we've got Omicron and we've got lots of people coming through?
Tanya Potu has made a complaint to the Mid-Central District Health Board. The Doctors Association says such problems are happening in other parts of the country too, but Dr Powell says Palmerston North is one of the worst and patient numbers are increasing.
The size of the ED itself has not kept pace with that demand, nor have the staffing levels of both resident doctors and nurses in that facility. It's just getting worse.
She says resident doctors at the hospital are reporting burnout and poor job satisfaction. RNZ has approached the Mid-Central District Health Board for an interview. We are yet to hear back as the program goes to air. RNZ has previously reported dissatisfaction among staff that a facility built for 17,000 people a year is seeing almost 3 times that number. Mid-Central reporting shows almost 48,000 people came through the department in the year to the end of October. More space has been created in the department for observation, planning and assessment.
Well, the Mid-Central DHB has now got in contact and sent us a statement which says the average wait time in ED over the past 3 months is 6 hours and 22 minutes. It says road trauma presentations have increased above the baseline of 33 to 58 in both November and December. 58 is the highest number in the past 18 months. This is one contributing factor to the wait times in the ED. It says acute flow continues to be a challenge for the organisation and this is a priority focus. The DHB is making progress to improve the time frame from ED to discharge. A new facility is being established which the DHB says will assist in managing the flow of people through the hospital. It is almost 17 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The government wants to introduce new regulations that will shift the power imbalance between property managers, tenants and landlords. New Zealand is one of the few countries in the OECD that doesn't regulate property managers, something the government wants to change. But the Green Party and advocates warn that more than half of rental properties won't be covered. Here's political reporter Charlie Drever.
Renters United spokesperson Ashok Jacob says there has always been a power imbalance between renters and those keeping a roof over their head. But as of late, that problem has only been exacerbated by a lack of housing supply.
People don't even necessarily have the option of moving and finding somewhere else to live. In a lot of cases, there physically isn't anywhere else to live. And so people are just going to put up with more and more crap from their property managers.
He welcomed any changes that would better regulate the sector. The Associate Housing Minister, Poto Williams, says the sector has long been calling for such changes.
They want to professionalise their sector and they do want to ensure that their managers know the information, they know the regulations, they know the standards they need to meet. So this gives them the tools to do that.
National's deputy leader and housing spokesperson Nicola Willis says she wants to make sure it doesn't further increase rents or cause any other unintended consequences.
I just point to the triple CFA regulations. There was great intention there. Let's make sure that loan sharks don't lend in a bad way. The result, everyday New Zealanders are finding it very hard to access a mortgage. So that's why National will study these proposals very carefully.
The discussion document will go out for feedback, with submissions closing mid-April. But Greens housing spokesperson Chloe Swarbrick says renters can't live in a discussion document and the government should be moving faster.
It's really unclear as to why we've decided to go out and have this entirely new consultation process to then form up what the legislation is going to look like. Obviously, that's typically what a select committee process would look like, especially when the government has identified and nailed down what its preferred proposals actually are.
The residential property management sector manages about 42% of rentals on behalf of property owners. Chloe Swarbrick says the changes would miss more than half the sector.
There is no intention to also regulate landlords who manage their own properties. Of course, this is also a huge problem and a huge gap when it comes to particularly upskilling people so that they're aware of their rights and responsibilities.
The Greens want a register for both property managers and private landlords. Ashik Jacob agrees and says there's no evidence that private landlords are any better than property managers.
I think if you're providing a home to somebody, that's a human right. That's the most essential service that you can have. I mean, it's kind of insane to me that you're allowed to do that with pretty much no form of government oversight.
Pottle Williams says the Residential Tenancy Act also helps even the playing field for renters.
However, there is still the issue of bad behaviour by some landlords who won't be looking to comply with anything, and that's another issue that we will have to tackle. What we hope to do is to look at this as part of a whole suite of changes that we've made since we've come to government.
Pottle Williams says she expects the regulations for property managers will be in place as early as next year.
Right, just an update on traffic in Auckland. Police say all southbound lanes have reopened after that truck crash that blocked Auckland's southwestern motorway earlier. The crash was near Puhinui Road. Go carefully if you're driving that way. The protests in Canada are continuing. Ottawa's police chief has resigned after weeks of criticism for his handling of anti-vaccine mandate protests that have paralysed the Canadian capital. Yesterday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act in response to the protests, but demonstrators so far have remained defiant. CNN's Paula Newton reports.
The rowdy backdrop for these protests obscures a threat that Canadian officials say is real. This movement, they say, now in its third week, is a threat to public safety.
It is now clear that there are serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law.
In an historic move, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time. And while he said it will be limited geographically and in scope, it will allow for stronger enforcement. The protests right across the country, especially at border crossings, have proven to be determined and apparently potentially dangerous.
This is not a peaceful protest.
Police in Alberta allege a small group within the protests had a stash of weapons and were willing to do harm at the Alberta-Montana border if attempts were made to disrupt the blockade. And the war of words spills out daily on Ottawa's streets. Differences on COVID pitting protesters against residents.
I mean, there's people here that traveled across the country. If you want to talk to real people,
he knows everything. He's awesome. He's from Alberta or whatever.
Yeah, sure. I'm from.
Yeah, they're destroying Canada, but
you know what? Talk to someone who's lost their job. Talk to someone who's lost their business, and we'll give you a clear perspective on what's going on here. We don't want to be in Ottawa. We don't want to be in your backyard.
You'll get the real picture from him.
No,
he took it from Facebook too.
The people from around this country have come here because we want to stand up for our freedom, and we will stand up for our freedom.
The so-called quest for freedom has made many of those downtown feel like they're in a noisy, chaotic prison.
To shut down the city, to harass and intimidate local residents to this extent, I wouldn't have thought that the police and the government would allow it.
And so Trudeau is saying enough. Now, while he says the military won't be called in, he is using more enforcement power and imposing stiff financial penalties, which could bankrupt some protesters and risks further inflaming an already tense situation.
In a humiliating step that has cemented the damage to his reputation, Prince Andrew has reached an out-of-court settlement with the woman who alleges she was trafficked to him when she was a teenager. The settlement means Prince Andrew will not have to stand trial in a civil sexual assault case brought in New York after the settlement was agreed with Virginia Giuffre. The settlement does not contain any admissions from the prince, but involves an undisclosed financial payment. The ABC's Barbara Miller reports.
Prince Andrew and his accuser, Virginia Giuffre, have reached an out-of-court settlement at a crucial time. After having failed to get the case dismissed by a New York court, the Queen's son was facing the prospect of giving testimony under oath to Ms Giuffre's lawyers as part of what's known as pre-trial discovery. Laurie Levinson is a professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and former federal prosecutor.
This is exactly the time where it made sense for them to reach an agreement. Because after this, once he's subject to questioning under oath, and it all comes out anyways, it would be very hard to reach the agreement.
The settlement sum is undisclosed, but is likely to be in the millions of dollars. There's no admission of guilt from the prince to the allegations Virginia Giuffre was trafficked to him for sex by the now late financier Jeffrey Epstein when she was a teenager. However, the prince has agreed to make a substantial donation to Ms Giuffre's charity for sex abuse victims. He's also accepted that the 38-year-old who lives in Australia is an established victim of abuse. And further, he's pledged, according to court documents, to demonstrate his regret for associating with Jeffrey Epstein. Laurie Levinson.
So he admitted and showed sympathy all along the edges. In other words, he said, look, I support abuse victims, I support her, I support the causes. But the one thing he didn't say is, I did it.
After his now infamous BBC interview in 2019, Prince Andrew stepped back from royal duties. Last month, he was stripped of his military titles and the right to call himself His Royal Highness. Victoria Arbiter is a royal commentator.
Prince Andrew's public life is finished. There is absolutely no way back for him. Now, even if he was able to clear his name, I think people have just been left with such a distaste in their mouth because initially he didn't seem terribly empathetic or compassionate. He's done. We will not be seeing him any further.
This is a big year for the Queen, who's celebrating 70 years on the throne. But royal commentator Victoria Arbiter thinks her son Prince Andrew's role in any public events will be kept to an absolute minimum.
If they were to extend an olive branch, the only area I could see him being involved is in the service of Thanksgiving, a religious service. That's the only way, perhaps, to see Prince Andrew joining the rest of the royal family in church. It seems an appropriate place for him to be. But I think they're very conscious of the fact that were he to join in anything, the headlines will be dominated by Prince Andrew welcome back into the fold, Prince Andrew giving a nod of approval by the royal family. They're going to want to avoid that at all costs.
The case is expected to be officially dismissed within 30 days.
At the Winter Olympics, Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva has taken to the ice after being allowed back despite a failed doping test. The 15-year-old told officials the positive test was the result of an innocent mix-up with her grandfather's medication. CNN's Selena Wang watched her return to the ice.
Kamila Valieva, Russian figure skater and favourite to take individual gold at these Olympics, raced into the lead of the women's single skating competition, allowed that chance despite her testing positive before the games for a banned drug. Valieva defended her positive drug test by saying it was caused by a mix-up with her grandfather's heart medication. The 15-year-old stumbled on her first jump, but she gave an otherwise stellar performance, sealing her place in Thursday's free skating program. Valieva visibly emotional when she finished her routine. Valieva returned the drug test on Christmas Day, but it was only last week that the sample was reported to have come back positive for the drug trimetazidine, after she and her teammates had already won gold here. The World Anti-Doping Agency says it will also be investigating her entourage, and the teen could still be stripped of her medal. A glimpse behind the glimmering surface into the murky world of Russian sports. Team USA not holding back in a statement. Quote, this appears to be another chapter in the systematic and pervasive disregard for clean sport by Russia. The Russian Figure Skating Federation president labeling the decision common sense and justice. But though the Russian Olympic Committee says Valieva tested negative for banned performance-enhancing drugs before and after the test in question, inescapable is the fact that clean athletes are performing against a competition favorite who tested positive once. At an Olympics dogged by politics and China's rights record, this doping scandal tainting the sport here as well.
Right, let's get to some of your feedback before we head off on the Seymour situation, talking to protesters. This person says, good on David Seymour to begin to break the impasse. Everyone needs to curb the power play and come to the table. Other end of the spectrum, this one in. The ACT leader is simply a vote-grabbing opportunist. Most of us agree with the government's response, which is world-leading. I'm disgusted with his attempt to build himself up. And another listener says, the Wellington situation is clearly out of hand because of extended hand-wringing and some warped thinking that it's okay for a small number to bring the streets to a standstill in the name of the right to protest. Now the horse is bolted and everyone is scrambling. And you have an awful lot to say about rubbish. This is on the bin tag trial over on the North Shore, West Auckland and Papakura, I think it was. This person says, I can't believe Auckland is so backward with rubbish collection. Educate people to separate their green waste for weekly collection and offer small bins for fortnightly collection to the landfill, as has been done in Christchurch for years. And Mark says, a lot of places in Auckland have an 80-litre bin as standard, Mount Albert, Epsom, Onehonga. We can cope with the small bin. I think it's a good idea to try and make the city send less to the landfill. And Mark goes on to say it might mean that the new Dome Valley landfill is no longer needed. And this person says that they're in the Western Bay of Plenty, they've got a new rates-funded scheme, plus pay-as-you-go, came in July 2021. They have only put their bin out 3 times since July. 3 times. Now, remember, if you missed anything from the show, you can find Checkpoint on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you find your podcasts. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō tomorrow from 5 a.m. First up asks Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson about wage subsidies for those businesses hit hard by Omicron and what it will take to get rid of Parliament's protesters. Catch you tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Good evening, kia ora tātou, ko Ivy Ashton tēnei. Police are holding off towing hundreds of illegally parked vehicles belonging to anti-mandate protesters at Parliament, saying they're making good progress on negotiations. Meanwhile, a man at a Picton Park protest says they'd leave if the Prime Minister came to listen to them. ACT leader David Seymour won't name protesters he met with today, but says one is a well-known Wellington business owner. And health authorities are urging people to keep on scanning with the COVID-19 app as Omicron numbers reach new heights. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7 o'clock.
Well, they wouldn't stand a chance, though, would they, with the might of Russia on their border?
This is a big country, and Russia would struggle to control this country.
I guess from many people listening, their perspective will be they have been vaccinated, so therefore I'm less likely to pass this on to somebody who may get very sick from it.
Has anybody ever worried before about infecting someone else? Have they?
I think so.
How many, as far as I'm concerned, it's a new phenomenon.
Lately with Karen Hay, every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Thanks, Karen, and I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National.